Having such terrible thoughts. You'd say that it won't happen, but you said you'd help and you haven't. I've been cutting everyone off, get a head start on my run. I won't be your sheep, your coin, or your son. Use it just in the spread against coherent yet unknown name. Oh, can you put me in coach? 'Cause I was born for this language game. To fall on your side means that I lie. On the other, I would die. I just crucify. I just crucify. I just crucify. I just crucify.
Hey everyone, welcome to Apocalypse Here, Christianity You Can Live With, / Laura's crocheting time.
Crocheting hour.
We got our producer Bulbasaur in the back, ready to go. Let me, before we get started with our interview today, I'm going to give you kind of a rundown of the guests that we've got coming up. We've got a pretty good lineup of people in the next few weeks. Next week we have Aaron Griffith, who has recently written a book called God's Law and Order, basically tracing the history of the relationship between evangelicalism and mass incarceration. It's a really, really awesome book, and I'm excited to interview him about that. The week after that, we have Melissa Flor Bixler, and we're going to be talking to her about finding God in the Old Testament. And then we have some more people that are potentially be interviewed in December, trying to work out some schedules. But yeah, so without further ado, I'm going to bring in our guest. 1 second. There he is. Michael DePue. How's it going?
It's going all right. How are you?
Doing pretty good. So obviously with the same last names,
They're married.
we're married.
So, yeah.
We just live states apart. No, Michael is my older brother, and I thought it'd be good to have him on because his work in theological ethics is really interesting. I think that y'all who have been asking questions actually about economics will find this fascinating. So, Michael, why don't you kind of introduce yourself, even though I just told people who you are, but what do you do?
You're actually not on the show because you're John's brother.
No,
But that's why we know who you are. But you have qualifications other than that. So
Yeah.
Yeah. So it's just like low key nepotism, not
Low key. Yeah, that's a great way of putting it.
not
Yeah,
like
low key.
some style. I'm not involved in the production. I didn't suggest myself to be on the show.
No, you didn't ask. Yeah, I kind of forced you to
In
do
fact,
it.
I
Yeah.
might have asked not to be.
Yeah, and then I was like, no, you have to. Yeah.
Right. So I'm studying at Boston College. I am, as of 2-3 weeks ago, a PhD candidate, which is the fancy academic term that means I've passed my comprehensive exams, and I only have my dissertation left. So that's what I'm working on in the next year to year and a half. I'm interested in a lot of things, too many things. The main thing I think we're going to talk about here is my interest in economic ethics or political economy, or however you sort of want to talk about that. I should also note that Shadowlands, the new World of Warcraft expansion, came out yesterday, so the quicker we can get through this,
The faster you can play Warcraft.
the faster I can get back to what's
You
good.
asshole. All right, we'll get you out of here so you can play that.
You can play your game.
Right, thank you.
Oh yeah, for sure. So how did you sort of become interested in pursuing degrees in religious studies? So you have a BA in religion from Simpson College. We had our former theology prof on a couple weeks ago.
Yeah.
So how did you become interested in the sort of broad subject of religious studies, and then ultimately you went on to pursue the terminal degree, which you're in? So how did that sort of happen?
Right. I mean, this will be helpful for anybody who's listening, because it'll also give the reasons why Jon did these things, because he copied.
I did. Yeah, that's. I mean, this is the
Jon plagiarized your life.
Yeah. So
Yeah.
being Michael's younger brother, that's basically what my whole life was, even beyond, academic interests. I just copied everything you did.
Right.
Pretty
I mean,
much.
there was that like year and a half of doing your theoretical phys ed. at Simpson.
Theoretical exercise science.
Yeah.
That was fun.
Jon's failed jock experiment.
Yeah.
I don't have like a moment of identifiable like, oh, this was the thing that I read or did that made me interested in these things. Growing up, both of our parents were pretty active in church in a fairly complicated way. I actually don't know if they're listening to this, so this will, I don't think it will embarrass them. The churches that I most remember growing up in were fairly evangelical churches. I think I was actually baptized in a Lutheran church. I don't think you...
How old are you when you were baptized?
I was an infant. So
I didn't know.
I got it twice, just in case the first one didn't stick. Man,
Okay.
It's a Lutheran church in Ames, I think,
Gotcha.
or somewhere around there that they were going to.
But our parents always had a kind of odd relationship to the church, that the kind of churches that we went to, mainly that they were a part of churches primarily because they thought that they could help and that they were meant to be with these people, and not because there was a kind of one-for-one uniform agreement theologically. So it was a very Catholic way to be Protestant.
That's a good way of putting it.
That's an oversimplification. I'm sure that upset everyone I mentioned in that analogy. But what that meant was that we were really encouraged to talk to our parents, especially about scripture, about the Bible, about the things we were learning in Sunday school. And often the answers that at least I would get from my dad especially was things that would get me into trouble if I said them in Sunday school. So I have a memory of asking our dad, like, why aren't dinosaurs in the Bible? And because I was young, I was probably 10, it wasn't a sort of gotcha question the way people might ask it now. It was like, dinosaurs are the coolest things that have ever existed. Why wouldn't they be in the Bible? Like, what's going on? And so he did a really good job of talking about the Old Testament and what the creation story was supposed to be doing, and that it's not really schedule and this sort of thing. And so, I was like, oh, this is really interesting. This is great. And so, I go to Sunday school, and the next time we talked about that, I was like, oh, like, I have a cool thing to say about this. And repeated it as kids do. And I remember the Sunday school teacher like pausing and looking at me and saying, I think if God said day, God meant day. And even at that point, I realized, I was like, that's not, I don't, that's, I'm
That
not,
makes
I'm
sense.
not really on board with whatever's happening right now. That's way less interesting, and it makes it so dinosaurs can't be there. So that's obviously the wrong answer.
Right.
So I was always interested in those sorts of questions, even if they didn't have to do with dinosaurs. Eventually, that was the start.
But principally so, yeah, right.
Dinosaurs to begin with.
Yeah.
And as we got older, our dad was also pretty into existentialism. I would come to find out, I didn't know it at the time, but people like Soren Kierkegaard, Jean-Paul Sartre, Nietzsche, this sort of stuff. So we had a bunch of books at our house that were there. But he was actually a history teacher, and so we also had sort of the classic works of fiction, and those were always really interesting. And I was enough of a nerd to just pick those books up and read through them. And I do remember some C.S. Lewis and Dietrich Bonhoeffer books being particularly interesting.
I think he had a copy of the Confessions too, right?
Yes, yeah.
And City of God, possibly, something like that.
Yeah. So those were always really interesting to me. When it came time to go to college, what I thought I was interested in was philosophy, the kind of thinking and metaphysics. How do we understand how it is that we exist? What do those sorts of questions look like? So that's what I went into college intending to pursue a philosophy degree, and then I was always good at school, so it made sense to pursue an academic career. But honestly, one of the biggest reasons why I'm not doing philosophy proper and I'm doing something called Theological Ethics was taking a class with Dr. Mark Gammon, who you had on 3 weeks ago, something like that.
Yeah.
And then reading Augustine, even Aquinas and Luther and Calvin, and seeing people really wrestle with the meaning of existence in light of Jesus Christ. And eventually I realized that was what I wanted to do, not just thinking about things generally, cool concepts, but there was something almost inescapable about that sort of intellectual posture of deep reflection on the meaning of Christ and how that matters to people. Because at Simpson, we didn't have a theology department, we had a religious studies, a religion department. Which, in as much as those don't matter, it did matter there because there was always this slant of, we're studying these things not primarily to figure out what's true once and for all, but because people care about these questions. And you can sort of take that in different ways. You can push it forward into the more traditional theological route and say, like, okay, but what actually is true? How do we talk truly about God? But there's this other path that you can take, and as much as I'm trying to be an academic, I'm trying to do both of these things.
Yeah.
How do we speak rightly of God? But also, what do people think that their beliefs about God mean for how they interact with other people?
Right.
So that's a more traditionally religious studies sort of thing. You could articulate that almost as purely sociological, that you can pursue it under those sorts of that discipline. But trying to do both of those things together was really interesting and compelling. And I mean, I guess I did sort of copy Gammon, going to Duke and then to Boston College.
I mean, you're doing the same degree. Yeah.
Right. Well, they did change the name. They changed the name. When he was at Boston College, it was moral theology, and now it's theology.
Yeah.
Please don't ask me to explain the difference.
Yeah. So before we get into sort of the main topic, which is economic ethics, and sort of talk about capitalism and kind of moral formation as well within that. For someone who has no idea what the hell you're talking about when you say theological ethics, how would you explain that?
I'm the worst person to ask this question to, because I may also think that it's not a real category. But I'll do my best. Primarily, it's an academic discipline.
Mm-hmm.
When you say something like theological ethics, you're talking about an academic discipline. And so I'm going to talk about it at this level. It's not the way that I, most of the time, understand what I'm doing myself. But I have to make certain committees understand what I'm saying fits into this category called theological ethics.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm going to talk about it in the Catholic world first. I'm not Catholic, but I do go to a Catholic school, and I think it's actually an easier category to understand in the way Catholic theology as a kind of framework is set up. So for Catholic theology, there's dogmatic theology, which includes official church teachings on things. It includes the conciliar teachings, the various councils, and that's it's not a closed system, but it's an identifiable body of stuff. And then you have systematic theologians who are tasked with engaging with dogmatic theology, clarifying it, even at times pushing it forward, reforming it, trying to continue to work in this inexhaustible space that is reflection on God. Theological ethics is the task of taking the dogmatic and systematic theology and creating a bridge between that and people's lived experiences.
Mm-hmm.
Between how what we say is true about God matters to how we treat others, how we understand ourselves in relation to others, how we respond to God's activity in the world. For Protestant theology, it's a much fuzzier picture. There are Protestant denominations that might have something that fills a similar role to something like dogmatic theology, but it's not as exhaustive as the Catholic Church has. Even the Eastern Orthodox Church doesn't sort of put up this huge body of work in the same way that the Catholic Church does. So for Protestants like myself, I tend to think of my work as theology running in a certain direction, which is towards experience. It's not a purely one-directional movement, but it's trying to take what it is we think is true about God and to sort of make that collide with life.
Yeah.
And then do that in meaningful ways that hopefully illuminate both directions.
Mm-hmm.
But as a discipline, theological ethics is usually means you're interacting with one or more social sciences, because in the academy, that's how you get access to something like experience. So for me, it tends to be sociology and economics. Other people will deal with medical literature, like global political theory, these other
stuff.
These other sorts of areas. But I do want to say, like, theological ethics as a category, if you don't understand, like, that's fine. The only reason you need to understand it as a category is if you're in the academy.
If you're doing it in a professional way,
on that level.
So it's just kind of playing the academic game, really.
Right. That's not to say that it's not helpful. Right. It isn't primarily how I even understand my own.
That must be bad.
Yeah.
Are people having trouble hearing?
Yeah.
I think it's background noise
yeah.
for you. I don't know what that is.
I can put on headphones and see if that works. We can answer the mic.
Let's see if that does something.
There isn't a lot of background noise here.
It may be just where you're positioned in the room. We get kind of echo. Yeah, I don't know. The headphones will probably help.
How's this for people?
I think that's better. There's no background noise.
Great.
Okay. Let me
it does mess up the hair a little bit, but I'll sacrifice.
That's what's really important about this. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, so you're essentially what you're saying is that theological ethics as a sort of discipline within theology is something that's really within sort of the academic world. It's not. It's fine if people are confused about what it actually means for everyday life.
Right.
Yeah.
I should also say that the thing I just said is a contested claim. There are people who really see not only academic, like disciplinary differences, but methodological differences between systematic theology on the one hand and theological ethics, moral theology, however you want to talk about it on the other hand. I just disagree.
Yeah.
But that there are people who I've had this argument with. And there are ways of doing both systematic theology and theological ethics that seem incommensurable.
Sure.
Like you can sort of run those academic programs in certain ways that make it actually pretty difficult to talk to each other.
Yeah. Right.
But as far as what I'm doing,
yeah,
I would say I'm a theologian who's concerned about these particular things, and that's what I see myself doing.
Yeah. So, like you said, you're a PhD candidate now, having passed your comprehensive exams, and you're kind of beginning to hone in on your dissertation topic, which has to do with economic ethics. Can you kind of give us just a brief overview of what you were at this point kind of planning to do, and maybe the way to do this is sort of to kind of summarize the dominant approach to economic ethics among people, and then kind of the problems with that, and then kind of where you see a better way forward.
Sure. I will also say that I am pre-dissertation proposal, which means right this morning I emailed my advisor with with updates about
really,
how I'm thinking about stuff.
Sure.
The main thing that got me into this topic was actually, I don't know. I don't want to bash people who no one here is really concerned about. But I'll try to talk in broad vague strokes. In a lot of the academic and even some popular literature that has to do with Christian responses to things like consumerism or economics in general, the focus really is on how do we become a Christian consumer? How do we think about the way that the things we buy matter because we are Christians? And I think that's good as far as it goes. I just don't think it goes very far. And for most people, their main engagement with the economy is on the side of labor. Like you spend a lot more time, most people spend a lot more time working, either at a job or domestic labor, care labor for a grandparent or for anyone, than they do like shopping. And so that's that gap between how people were talking and what to me seems the self-evident truth of what it means to have to live in the kind of economy we live in was fairly startling. And so that was the sort of beginning of me turning towards this subject.
It is interesting. Sorry.
Go ahead.
I was going to say that it is interesting when you think about even popular titles on this subject in New Testament literature, in theological ethics and in theological literature on this subject. How often the starting point is the assumption of mass consumption in materialism. Like you think about texts like Rich Christians in an Age of Wealth.
Yeah, right.
It was just is that really is this the major story in American economics, is having a bunch of stuff? Is this the major story?
Right.
Yeah.
So it has this unintentional, I think most of the time, unintentional effect of actually speaking to a very limited set of experiences. And the people for whom they experience the economy primarily as consumers are people who have wealth built up and they don't need to work anymore. And that's not a big chunk of the population. So I'm trying to not do that, basically, and to say, well, what happens if we treat labor, like the work that we do, as a place to think and discern Christian ethics? The question was what am I doing? So I'm trying to do that. And I will plug positively this book, because these days, Human Capital in the Making of Millennials by Malcolm Harris.
Yep, we've got a link to that in the description of the video, so you can check it out. Good.
Because it is not a theological text But for those of us who grew up in this generation, it's an extremely insightful account of what it meant, what it felt like to grow up as a millennial. It's really good. I think we might talk about it more later.
Yeah.
But so reading that around the time I was doing some coursework on moral agency, which is where I was reading a lot of the other approaches to Christian economic ethics. Reading those two things together was sort of the spark that was that became the real reason I was turned to this sort of work. So what I'm constructively trying to do is give an account of neighbor love that I think is adequate to meet the particular questions and challenges that we face in contemporary US by being participants in the economy, both as consumers, but primarily as workers, and all the things that go with that.
Right. You mentioned labor as a particular site of moral discernment was kind of the way that you phrased it. Can you unpack that a little bit? What do you mean by a site of moral discernment?
Sure. I mean, it's a place where we are faced with moral decisions, and I don't think they're always obvious to people. Sometimes they're super obvious. If you're like, for example, if you're an architect and someone comes and asks you to build a prison, like at some point,
sure, yeah.
you should some kind of alarm bell should go off.
Yeah, hopefully.
Right.
Yeah.
And so lots of people will have stories of their employers asking them to do not just like unscrupulous things, but like really morally damaging things.
Both on kind of a larger scale, and also kind of, you can think about this interpersonally too, right? Yeah.
Yes, interpersonally.
Right.
So you have that. It's clear to me that it's possible. Like, there are moral stakes to work,
mm-hmm.
and at the same time, we are in a system where most people don't have full control to sort of opt out, to actually say no to a lot of these things. The current pandemic, while it doesn't sort of prove this in a unique way, it makes it really easy to see where if you are an employee who's not an essential worker, but you're in a state where you are expected to work, and there isn't there's no emergency funding for people to stay home. You're being asked to put other people's lives at risk, because the other option for you is to lose your income and the security that comes along with that. So for a lot of people now who might not have always been able to see clearly the way that these things were related, all of a sudden, like, oh, we have this huge global pandemic that, among a variety of other things, it actually helps. It more clearly exposes the moral decision making that's inherent in working, and especially the way in which we are also compelled into those decisions.
Yeah,
you can't just say like, well, I'm not going to work. And then if you add on to that, if you're responsible for children, if you're responsible for elderly people, it adds all of these other layers.
But yeah, other moral questions in terms of responsibility to
right.
those people. Yeah, right. Right.
And so those questions are there all of the time. It's not that the COVID sort of created a new crisis. It just made it more obvious. It sort of expanded it turned down the opacity meter on something that was always there. And now it's a lot easier for people to see.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, why don't we get into a bit of Malcolm Harris's book, and sort of what he's doing there and why he's so important.
Yes, yeah. There are people in chat already saying like, yes, that's what I experienced that.
Yeah, right. Right. Yeah,
so
I know Spartan. Spartan's in Texas, and that's a state that's sort of been pretty relaxed on the COVID restriction stuff.
But I do want to say that, like, even if your state is doing a good job of shutting things down that need to be shut down, if you're not also given material resources,
then
you still have to do you go look for some other kind of work, like how like you're still put in these situations. So it's not simply the case that like, oh, we're in need of strong government responsibility for shutting things down. If it doesn't come along with actual support for people,
actually giving people money,
right, you're just sort of what happens is you that actually hides the problem even more, because then you're like you're sort of you're left to your own devices to try to figure out how am I supposed to feed myself, the people that I'm responsible for, all these sorts of things.
For sure. So kids these days, what is Harris sort of doing in that book, and then why do you find it so helpful for your own thinking about economic ethics?
Sure. There's some great reviews of the book that I would encourage people to go find. I think there was a comment.
If you want to send me those after we get done here, I can put them in the description too.
Because I think the Sojourners or Commonweal one that was particularly geared at Christians.
Mm-hmm.
But his central thesis of the book is that all of these stereotypes that we have about millennials, not all, but a lot of the stereotypes we have about millennials are sort of inverse or counterintuitively true, but they're true for different reasons than the sort of standard millennials are always on their phone sort of thing. So this is a good one. I really like this one. It is true that people of our generation use phones a lot more, although I see plenty of older people staring at their phones.
I don't really buy that.
But what it does, one of the meaningful things that does is makes you accessible to your employer almost 24/7 in a way that wasn't possible before. If you left your job, maybe they had your home phone number, but they weren't, and they could call it, and if you didn't pick up, they were out of luck. But now it means you can be on the clock for a lot more time than you could before.
Yeah.
So he does this with a lot of things. Doing it using the phone thing as an example might make it seem like it's this kind of like, oh well, I mean that's kind of true, but like that's part of it. But a lot of the book focuses on education, primary school, secondary education, and the way that is actually geared toward not education, but sort of forming productive workers. My favorite example of this, which is not in the book, but is I think I experienced, and talking to lots of other people they experienced. Did you all take like a Myers-Briggs personality test in school ever? Yeah. Do you remember what happened after you took the test? Like you got your results back?
You get told the careers you're supposed to have.
Yeah, the options, the career options. Yeah.
Yes.
Right.
So then you're like, okay, based on your personality type,
Then
here's
you're
the
locked
kind of
into
work
yeah, right.
that you would be productive, most productive in.
Right.
That's what happens. And so there are all of these ways, and that standardized testing gets turned towards this. You could talk to any secondary education teacher. They don't think that the best way that kids learn is to keep testing them over and over again.
No, one thing I will say about testing really fast, though, is that testing is oftentimes how we collect data about schools. It's not really an educational tool. So I think that's an important thing to remember with testing, is that testing was not designed to be an educational tool. It was designed to be a way we get information about schools. So, and it's hard to understand, but.
So that is 100% true, but part of what goes along with that is that funding is often tied to that.
Yeah, for sure.
Which means then that the educational time is more and more directed towards those exams rather than education in and for itself. Because the school doesn't have, like, if they don't perform well enough on the exams, they lose funding. Like, so these sorts of questions. So I'm not sort of here saying that schools should stop doing it. I'm saying that we have created a situation in which for the school to continue to survive, to continue to have funding to do whatever amount of education it's still able to pull off, that's not just teaching for standardized tests. It has to do this to some degree, and education and data collection is a whole big thing that would have somebody else on to talk about that.
Like our dad.
Right. But even because but also what other? It's not that standardized testing or data collection is in and of itself bad.
It's what
probably
do
good
with
to have
too, and what's it for?
It's probably to do that, but because it's tied to all of these other other things. It becomes this. It has a kind of gravity to it that pulls in things that shouldn't be attracted to it. That shouldn't be directed towards it. That there should be this other thing like teaching students, how to read, how to write, how to do math, for the sake of those things, for the sake of learning, for the sake of, teaching people stuff, not for it shouldn't be dependent. The school shouldn't be dependent on these tests in order to keep surviving, because it has this effect. And so this is a good example of part of Harris's argument here, is that we're in a time and place where the economic has sort of these kind of effects on a bunch of things that in the past there were sort of barriers to. That we had some sense that not everything needed to be directed around the economic. And in short, his thesis is that millennials are the way they are because they are the first generation of people to be treated, to be raised in order to be a kind of investment. Now, I do want to say there is, perhaps you could sort of level the criticism here that there's the history of slavery in the U.S. might at least complicate his claim of first. But I do think there is a particular, like, raising somebody as an investment is a particular claim that he does a really good job of defending. And I also send links out to this. There are also like major companies that will sort of buy stock in students. This was a thing that came out a couple of years ago, where in distinction from like a student loan where you're like paying this person, you're giving these people money to have an education, and then eventually they'll pay it back, theoretically, with the earnings that they will get because they have an education. Companies were sort of buying stock in students, saying like, we will give you this X amount of money now in return for X% of your future earnings, like literally treating them as a kind of investment. And so like, it's really obvious when those sorts of things happen. Another really obvious thing was the college admissions scandal that came out.
Yeah.
With the celebrities and whatever. I feel like I should have sources. There are sources.
Lori
people
Loughlin. Yeah.
Yeah. That one of the things that shows is that because it's admission, it was college admissions. It wasn't that like they weren't paying for tuition with that. They weren't buying tuition. They were buying access into the college. What they were actually purchasing was a certain kind of primary and secondary education, which proves that whatever work you do in school has an economic value because somebody's able to buy it. Somebody's able to counterfeit it. That it's worth something. Again, these are I'm going to guess that that these all come off as kind of esoteric or sort of odd examples. So I'm happy to try to answer more particular questions people have when it's that time.
Yeah, Spartan's right. There's Aunt Becky from Full House. Shout out to Full House.
The character, it was a weird.
There is an extra meta layer there.
Yeah,
right.
it just
Yeah, it was weird. It was real weird. Yeah. So throughout kind of what you've been saying, definitely read that book. Yeah.
Don't listen to me. I don't. You should have had Malcolm Harris on instead of me.
Yeah. He didn't respond. So he told us to stop calling, actually.
Yeah. How did you get this number?
So in a lot of what you've been saying about going back to kind of your point about moral discernment, and in contrast to sort of moral discernment within labor, in contrast to sort of thinking about being a responsible consumer kind of within an economic system. So there's a distinction between sort of moral responsibility within a system, which is sort of the former, and then toward kind of those structures as a laborer, really. Can you explain kind of a bit more about that distinction and why it's so important? Because what comes to mind for me is the often sort of libertarian response, which is like, I don't really have moral responsibility when it comes to economics because like that's just making me do stuff. I get to choose kind of when I engage ethically and morally with the system or whatever. So the situation kind of gets framed in terms of individual choice, right? Where you get to choose when to, or it gets phrased in that way instead of like communal responsibility by virtue of just being in a community of people, right? So I know those are kind of two different questions, why that distinction is so important between within and toward, and then how do you respond to this sort of, I guess, libertarian kind of pushback?
For the within and toward thing, I think there's that distinction still exists when thinking about labor, in parallel to the way it exists in thinking about consumers. So you'll hear lots of people, often more liberal people, talk about it being bad to shop at Walmart.
Yes, right.
Because the company's bad, extra bad maybe. But that assumes a kind of choice. Like, right, for some people, either that's the only place in town to buy whatever they need, or they have kids or people that they care about. They're on a limited income. There's a whole bunch of reasons why.
Yeah, that's what they can afford. Yeah,
somebody,
that's another reason. Yeah.
And so in a similar way, you could say, and people probably do, you shouldn't work for a company like that. You shouldn't work for Amazon or Walmart or whatever. On similar grounds, like you shouldn't participate, you shouldn't give your labor to a company that's doing these things. But and again, you have the same sort of complications with what actual choices do you have in the situation. So that both thinking in those terms is thinking about responsibility within structures. What I think we need to consider is that because we live in a country where we theoretically and sometimes actually have influence on political systems, because of the way that our country is set up, also bear responsibility towards those systems. So we have responsibility towards the creating the kind of context, creating the situation where people don't have any option but to shop at Walmart, don't have any option but to take a job at Amazon. And so like our responsibility can't just be in what kind of choices we make. I don't know if you're still there.
Yep, still here.
Okay.
Laura's gonna dip out for a bit, and then
okay.
We'll continue. Keep
Sorry,
going.
So much, Laura.
He said, "Sorry, he offended you so much."
But honestly, I hope it's not anything serious. So thinking about responsibility within structures is important, but we also have this other responsibility towards the way things are set up. If that makes sense. In terms of like sort of libertarian sorts of stuff, I want to start by saying like there are left libertarians. There are sort of leftist libertarians. Sure. And the sort of libertarian, imaginary person you're conjuring is a kind of sort of right libertarian. And on some level, I don't know if I have a good response at this level because I have different assumptions about what humans are. And what it means to be a person and that sort of thing. But in terms of pragmatic, like how do you, like in terms of just talking to people, I think trying to think about children is it can be a kind of bridge builder here. So
I'm assuming with other people who are parents, right?
I just mean generally, anybody, on the off chance that this person may have been a child at some point in their life, that it could also
it's
help.
about 50-50, yeah.
That there's really good evidence that the where you're born has a big impact on your life, like the economic context, not simply the context of your family, but like zip code even. And even if you want to turn a blind eye to sociology or whatever, it seems clear that in order for the sort of libertarian ideal to take place, That is, you're sort of this kind. You're in a position, actual position of decision making.
Mm-hmm.
That's what for yourself. There are certain things that have to already be in place about like health, about literacy, about transportation. Even you get these. You can get into arguments with people about it's really expensive to live in Boston or New York, and people just be like, well, just move, go somewhere else, find a job somewhere else.
Just get hired somewhere. Jeez.
Yeah. And so it's easier to sort of level those responses for an adult who is in good health and isn't affected by any number of things that a person can go through that it makes all these things difficult. It's another thing to tell a child whose parents are poor that you need to get a better job. Like you can't do that. So I think even if you want to sort of push for the sort of libertarian, rugged individualist ideal, you've got to get people to adulthood. If you're of the opinion that like children should be tasked with personal responsibility in the same way an adult should, I don't know how to talk to you, so I'm not that concerned.
Sure. Yeah. Right. It just
about it.
The person. Right.
I don't know who that is.
Yeah.
And the fact that child poverty is a continuing and growing problem in the way we have our current system set up, even at that level, like it seems to me that you should be able to have a kind of conversation about like, okay, like what do we actually need to provide to people as children for them to be able to get into this place where they actually are capable, have the resources of all kinds to take on individual personal responsibility. And then I would go on and argue after that about things, but in terms of talking to people who have different commitments than I do, it seems like there should be a shared sort of thing. So like on this end, I'll plug the People's Policy Project's work. They have a family fun pack. They have like a set of policies sort of directed towards this, about working towards securing children's lives in this way. What sort of policies could we realistically work on that would address this particular issue? And like I said, I'm going to have different assumptions and different end goals than libertarians in most stripes. But at that level, I think there, like I said, I don't know how to talk to somebody who thinks that a baby has the same sort of responsibility as an adult.
Sure. Yeah.
Yeah. So I'm trying to work here in good faith and assume that the imaginary libertarian you've conjured
that I just made up in my mind. Yeah.
Right. I want to be fair to that person.
Sure. I appreciate he appreciates that, or she. I don't know. So we're shifting gears kind of into the constructive kind of theological stuff that you're doing or planning to do as well. One of the key kind of theological themes in your thinking is neighbor love, which you mentioned earlier.
Yeah.
Which you sort of ground Christologically in a way that's influenced by some people we've talked about on this channel, like Karl Barth, Dietrich Bonhoeffer, and then some other people that maybe folks haven't heard of, like James Cone and Gustavo Gutierrez, of liberation theology folks as well. Why is Christology so important for your thinking in this way?
Yeah.
Other than that, you're just a Protestant.
Right. Yeah. So I will say this, that the people who have most influenced me immediately, like the people I know who have most influenced me on this point, are Catholics.
Keep
Catholics
going.
who-
By the way. I'm gonna stop my screen, but keep going.
Catholics who are committed to a certain strand of what they call Neo-Chalcedonian Christology, which is sorry, I just saw the lower the working age to 5 thing. You still got to account for those 2-year-olds. And one of the really important influential patristic sources for these people is Gregory of Nyssa. And while I was working on some of these other threads I've talked about, I was also reading Gregory of Nyssa's sermons on care for the poor and care for people with leprosy. And those are also all fantastic, and I recommend those. And for Gregory, there's a way that excluding the poor and the sick from Christian community, however we're doing it, is a kind of wound on the body of Christ. And hearing it articulated, reading it articulated like that was something that really clicked for me. I guess I don't how conceptual do you want me to get here? Do you want me to do the like logos sarcos stuff, or just like
definitely don't do that?
So
yeah.
Briefly, I am convinced that to claim that the person of Jesus Christ is the second person of the Trinity means that not only are we making a dogmatic claim, but that we are making a series of moral claims based on not only the life of Jesus, but on the revelation of a God who would become incarnate in the person of Jesus. And the way that, for example, Paul talks about the incarnation is love. And so the theme from all throughout the Old Testament, it's in Deuteronomy. You can go in Deuteronomy and you'll see this juxtaposition between the love of God and care for widows, orphans, and the stranger. Over and over and over again, they're put next to each other. Jesus does the exact same thing. That those two things are necessarily together, not simply in sort of Christ's moral teaching, but in the incarnation itself. That this is the revelation of God in Christ reveals a God who says yes to humanity. And that calls for humanity's response to also say yes to each other. That's the sort of shortened version of this.
Sure.
So that's why I think Christology is, for me, is the sort of starting point. Because I think it's the place where we begin to understand not only God, but also humanity.
Right.
And the humanity of God.
Right. Nice. Way to throw that in there. So I think so some Christians have a concept of neighbor love that is really just like being nice to people, which is kind of part
Sure.
of like, loving your neighbors, treating people with respect and dignity and all that sort of stuff.
Sure.
And it's sometimes kind of taught, I guess, in a way that's on the side. Like the important thing is that we're saved, right? We get saved by
Sure.
faith, and then we sort of go on and can do
Yeah.
neighbor love stuff. But you're situating neighbor love sort of smack dab in the middle of the gospel, which is Jesus,
Yeah.
right? In that kind
Yeah.
of yes. So what do you mean when you say neighbor love within that kind of, inside of that context?
Yeah, it's the you are participating in God's yes to humanity.
Okay. Yeah.
Which on some level is the same thing as salvation. It doesn't exhaust salvation. But it's not a second level reflection on what it is. So
or it's not another step like in a sequence, right? Like you this
right.
Ordo salutis, right? You get justified, sanctified,
Right.
sort of stuff.
Right. So here I always think of Calvin's concern. What is it? Osiander? Whoever the guy is who's running around during the early Reformation saying that justification and sanctification are the same thing.
Yep.
And Calvin is so concerned that he not be misunderstood to be saying that. And it's one of those, like, you seem like you're protesting too much, because like I think there's a certain strand of Reformed theology, and I think Bart picks up at this. And Jeff McSwain here is probably he's, when you had him on, he's doing something similar to what I'm after here.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if I want to go so far to conflate justification and sanctification, but I think the simultaneity stuff, like these are things that happen inescapably at the same time. I'm fine with doing that. But there tends to be a way, especially for Protestants, of a variety of stripes, to think about salvation, and then to even think about neighbor love as sort of a response to salvation.
Mm-hmm.
Again, which is good, and Bart talks like this sometimes. But I think the biblical witness pushes those things much closer together, and that in our effort to sort of articulate salvation so precisely, because we're so concerned with knowledge of salvation, that we overdetermine that distinction. That's what I'll say for now.
Yeah.
About that.
Yeah. That's helpful.
Before people call me Osiander and whatever.
That's fine. I've basically conflated sanctification and justification on this channel before. And you don't even want to do. Yeah, I think I think with respect to that, and this is kind of just a tangent, but just to kind of talk through this a bit. There is a difference between those two. The issue is when you put them into a sequence and say they have to sort of work that way. So you shift from, transfer from justification to sanctification, instead of justification, which are just words and phrases that are used. They're not doctrines. Like it's not an independent doctrine that stands up by itself. It's a way of nuancing kind of the gospel and what it means. So it's actually inside of sanctification, which is kind of really the gospel, right? Practiced with that inappropriate doctrine of election. I think that's just what the gospel is, right? And then justification refers to the specific entailment of being liberated from the clutches of sin and death and all of the bad stuff. So it's getting at something within sanctification, I think, but don't listen to me.
And ignore the chat for the time being.
Uh-oh. Oh man, hi Dad. Shout out to Jim DePue. in the chat. Okay. So, and I think I want you to be pretty kind of practical here. What are some ways in which this idea of neighbor love helps us sort of engage faithfully as Christians with economic issues? What is that actually sort of drives us to do that?
This is very practical, but it's very also not very specific. So it's a very Bardian sort of answer.
Okay.
The first thing I think that neighbor love calls us to do is to tell the truth. And I like, again, playing off of sort of ecumenical thing, because it's been my academic life. So if we think about confession in the Catholic Church has to do with the sacrament of penance, which is this, the going into the confessional booth, confessing your sins to a priest, receiving absolution. Confession in Protestant, especially Reformed tradition, confession more often than not means like confession of faith. And so we have these confessions that are much more like statements of faith. So on the one hand, you get confession, traditional Roth IRA, yeah.
Smart theology just scrolling away in the chat.
Yeah, you prayerfully wait for God's divine command in your particular situation.
There you go. God will tell you. God will speak.
Yep. I mean, the answer is Jesus, but like, who knows what Jesus wants in this particular. Anyway, so I want to try to hold both of those sort of senses of confession together at the same time. Telling the truth in the confessional means telling the truth about yourself in the way you have fallen short of of new creation in Christ. And confession, on the other hand, is telling the truth about who God is. I just had the impulse to say, like, I think sometimes we do a better job of telling the truth about who God is than we do telling the truth about our current situation, but that's not true. We're really bad at both of these things. But in terms of my project, what's the sort of foregrounded in my project is trying to tell the truth about our particular situation. So I'm less interested in sort of claiming socialism or Marxism or something like that than I am in trying to be honest about what it is to live right now, and the real moral choices that people are faced with, and that I have faith that the gospel reaches those things. I don't think I'm sort of conjuring, or I don't think it's anybody's job to sort of conjure connections, to sort of make the gospel relevant. But in having faith that it is, you then you seek understanding to say, okay, well, I trust God is here. Help me see. So I think kids these days, for my work, is a particularly helpful account, because he's telling the truth about so much. And as Christians, that's part of what it means to confess. And you can't love your neighbor if you're lying about them, if you're not honest about who they are, who you are, and how you are related. Yeah. And when I've talked with people in other contexts, I often get this sort of pushback, because people tend to associate, and not incorrectly, the sort of trajectory of my work with something like socialism social democracy or whatever. And
freaking commie. Yeah.
You get the sort of specter of communism or other forms of economic arrangements that have had, that have done violence to people. And my response is that we are given as Americans, this is the reality we're living with. If we want to argue later about how we should best set up something else, great, let's do that. But we're not going to get to that point unless we're honest about what it is we're going through, what the realities of life under capitalism and the particular moral challenges it forces upon us, and the way that we bear responsibility for those things.
Yeah.
And I think we would be called, in whatever context we are in, to do that. It just so happens that a lot of Christianity in the US has been uncritically allied with sort of laissez-faire economics. And so there's a whole lot of deconstructive work that needs to be done. So in terms of like, so I think that's very practical. Other people might not, but like the trying to tell the truth, which means paying attention to your neighbor, listening to them, and being honest about yourself and about how it is you relate to people. Like, again, this is actually a place where I think some of the more the works that I'm criticizing are actually helpful. The clothes you're wearing probably have a tag that says they were made in a different country.
Mm-hmm.
Like, that's insane.
Yeah.
But it's just part of our reality.
Yeah.
It would be crazy even if like they had wherever it came from had really good labor standards and people were well compensated. Like, it would still be a crazy thing for the vast majority of human experience, and still, even in our experience, we just don't think about it.
Yeah.
That the physical objects that we interact with, we don't have almost any knowledge of how they came to be, or who made them.
Yeah.
And so, and the other running it the other direction, which is one of the things I'm trying to do, is that the labor that we produce, the things that we make, often are also taken from us, and we don't see what happens to them. This is true in different senses as we continue to move away from manufacturing towards really service-heavy economy. When you're interacting with people and your labor has less material production, you're not making things as much as you are as like exchanging services for stuff. But even there, like there's distance that happens. So I think on the one hand, and this is suggested by lots of people, so people probably have heard this, but trying to figure out ways to create connections with people, for example, who grow your food.
Yeah.
And like, some places this is the farmer's market. Some places this might look like community supports agriculture. So I'll start there. The other thing is trying to figure out where you are geographically and politically, and look for people who are supporting workers, who are trying to give them choices that they wouldn't otherwise have. And because I don't think, I don't think that the Christian response necessarily needs to be, okay, like we need to move in and start creating like Christian farmers markets or Christian labor unions or something. That part of telling the truth about God also means telling the truth about where God is working before we even figured out there was a problem. So those sorts of things. And even wherever you work, trying to figure out ways to talk to the other people you work with to form whatever kinds of connections you can there that aren't about production, but are about care for people. Because I'm sure you can be sorted into teams at work in order to increase your production or something like that. But it's one thing to be in a job where you feel like you don't get paid enough and you're on your own. It's another thing to be in a job where you feel that way and somebody comes and talks to you about it.
Yeah, and you realize that other people are feeling that way too. Yeah, there's a kind of solid.
Realize other people are feeling that way. Right. Yeah. And so much of our contemporary context puts us into competition implicitly or explicitly with other people. This is one of the main difficulties to actually doing something other than what we have, is that we are in real competition with people for jobs. And jobs that pay well are getting more scarce. And those jobs that do pay well are less secure than they used to be. Again, this is all from Harris's book. You can find it there, and there's plenty of other research on this. That some of this has to do with the decline of labor unions. Some of it just has to do with like the rise of the gig economy and other forms of like really, really insecure labor. So trying to figure out how to talk to people, and this is pretty embarrassing for a lot of people. It would be embarrassing for me. It helps being a graduate student because like, oh, we're all pretty much on the same stipend in the department. But like, then you can ask other departments about like, oh, you guys don't, this is how much you get. It's different than what we get. Why is that? Those things. And if you have kids, or if you, for some reason, are in high school and listening to this, we got
a big, middle school, high school following. And,
big.
That's our demo, really. Yeah. So.
Right. Yeah.
People are doing this instead of doing homework, Yeah.
Right, which is good. That's what you should be doing. So we'll get some vaping advertisements and TikTok memes going on. That seems like the place to go. But if you have children, trying to pay attention to the way things like standardized testing works at your school, like figure out, like you should be able to follow state websites and stuff and figure out what's at stake for standardized testing. What would it mean for my child to opt out of those things? I'm not saying that I'm recommending that they do. I'm saying you should learn what's at stake. And then the other thing is there are some Christian communities. You and I know the people at Jubilee Baptist in Chapel Hill, who as a community are sort of committed to paying off each other's debts. Is it Sojourners? There's a Vox.
There's Vox that did the initial piece on it.
There's a profile, yeah. So that's just one community that we know of that's doing those sorts of things. So finding other people to talk to again, it's super hard right now. Like COVID makes it really difficult. But it might also make it more necessary if you are part of the workforce that is like working in person now. Like this seems like a great time to try to figure out what's at stake in your building, in your office, or wherever you are.
Yeah. A couple of things that I really like about what you were proposing, sort of theologically, and thinking, because I'm always thinking kind of Paul all the time, which is
that's new to me. I haven't.
Yeah.
I've never. I don't think I've ever heard you talk about Paul before.
No.
Is this like a new thing? Like you read a book or something?
Yeah.
On it, and
it's pretty old, but yeah. It's the way that this, and you talked about like neighbor love sort of being in the Old Testament, and then in Jesus's stories, and reference Paul too. But one thing that is sort of implicit in what you've been saying is the sort of relational nature of what it means to be a person, that we're all already sort of determined by and constituted by relationships, even relationships with people we don't even know, like the people who make our clothes. Like we're in a kind of connection with those people in a both a positive sense could be, and also in a kind of a way that exposes sort of the problems with potentially working conditions of the people who make the clothes, right? But what it's presupposing is that sort of already existing connection with other human beings, and that that actually makes us who we are as people, right? I think that's pretty in line with what someone like Paul is doing with personhood and what it means to be a human.
Sure.
Your point about geography is really interesting too, and it actually reminds me of Willie Jennings, his stuff on race and geography, and sort of thinking locally as sort of the initial site where sort of theology is done, and I think that's really really great. I've got one more question for you.
Hold on, I have a question for you. Is that I have one question for you. Is that a Fourth Time Sister shirt? Is that what you're wearing?
Yeah, it's the Fourth Time Sister. Women in Music.
Great.
Yeah.
Great. That's great.
I'm trying to replace Esty on bass, but she's better than me.
So you need to cross out the 4 and write.
No, so what I'm doing is I'm joining. I'm now a part of the band, and then I'm going to.
Okay, right. Eventually,
it's basically a coup. So,
right.
Yeah, we'll see if it works out. So I've got one more question, and then if anyone has questions who's still on, I think we have 6 people on. You can drop your question in the chat, and Michael may or may not answer them, depending on how good they are. So I'm not going to ask you the stupid last question that I was going to ask you.
Good, because I don't remember it.
Got a lot of people who listen to the show who aren't Christians, which has been kind of interesting. People might be wondering if this is kind of limited to a Christian approach, because you've talked about Jesus a lot and stuff like that. How does your kind of approach to economic ethics, or a better way to put this, can it lead to a kind of way of working together with non-Christians as well to address people's material needs? Or do you see this as a kind of specifically Christian approach?
So the civil rights movement was a theological movement in a lot of ways, but they were able to do it in a way that wasn't insular. Right. Perhaps one of the downsides of that is looking back on it, I don't know how many people recognize it as a theological movement, which in terms of like what it gained, that's not that big of a loss. But I think there, I think anyone who cares about the people around them in ways that could easily sort of rhyme or resound with this will find something. I can't say I can't make a claim to sort of universal appeal or anything like that, but I don't think Christians have a monopoly on caring about their neighbors. And more often than not, Christians have other things that preoccupy them.
Yeah, maybe
usually for the worse.
Yeah,
and so like,
go ahead.
I think like Harris's work on some level is ideological, but I don't mean that as a criticism. I mean that as like he has a particular sort of track, a particular sort of argument he's trying to make for the sake of politics.
Yeah.
And so at its best, I think the kind of theology I'm interested in could make connections between Christians and non-Christians possible that otherwise wouldn't be. This is mostly on the Christian side. I see more Christians unwilling to work with people who aren't than
no question. Yeah, no question about that. Yeah.
Although I also don't want to overstate the like, especially for Catholic leftists, there are some fairly. I'll leave that for another time. Just to say that I don't think there's a perfect sort of unity, but there should be enough here for people who are concerned about what it means to care for the people around them. That there should be places of rhyming and resonance, and this is all to say I want to say people can work together without necessarily.
Even if even if the rationale for like engaging in neighbor love is different, right? So Christological rationale, and then I don't know, humanist rationale. I'm not sure how people would kind of talk about that, but that those two things aren't really that far apart. The reasons for those, right?
Right.
Yeah. All right, so we have one question from Spartan. Michael brought up thinking locally, but how does the fact that so much of our lives is done online and with people all over affect that idea of thinking locally?
How do I want to? I think often, I guess there are two ways about this. One, it's true, no matter how cliche it is at this point, that those sorts of virtual relationships can get in the way of the people who are nearest to us. But it is also true that those sorts of virtual relationships can create friendships and other things, other ways of relating to people that can then sort of turn you back to your local context. Theoretically, that might accidentally happen right now. Like, I don't know any of these people. And so it's both a benefit and a drawback that through the sort of connectivity that the internet gives us, you bump into conversations that you wouldn't have otherwise bumped into, and often aren't actually conversations for you. But I think if you approach those conversations with humility, you can actually learn a lot from them, rather than trying to figure out how you fit into somebody else's conversation. And what I mean by this is, like, you will see on Twitter often people who have a shared interest, maybe with the Episcopal Church, for example. I don't, for whatever reason, I know a bunch of Episcopalians on Twitter. And that gives them a space to talk to people who they wouldn't otherwise interact with via geography, but they have this shared thing. That's great. And it can turn those conversations into meaningful action for the people wherever they are locally. But it also means that there's a bunch of other people who get upset with them being Episcopalian for whatever reason. And if your life is spent arguing with people online about why they should or shouldn't do anything, that would be a way that, like, oh, you're using technology as a way to sort of insulate yourself from actually having to act locally with people, because it's easier to argue with people online than it is in person most of the time. So that's what I'll say. It can be a detriment to acting locally, and it can also, depending on who you talk to, might actually help.
Yeah, for sure. Well, thanks, Mike, for being on and sharing what you were planning to work on for your dissertation. I hope you don't change it. It sounds fascinating to me.
Well, it doesn't exist, so I can't change it yet.
Well, yeah. I hope you don't change your mind about what.
Right. Okay.
To do, but looking forward to seeing it come to fruition at some point. Shout out to Bulbasaur and producer. Shout out to Heim for letting me join their band.
Yeah.
Shout out to Shoutouts. I think that covers it. Anyway, thanks for everyone who joined us on the live stream. I hope you enjoyed this conversation, and I hope it was helpful to think through sort of economic issues and maybe what you can do to participate in that more faithfully. So with that, this has been Apocalypse Here, Christianity You Can